This is the first in our series of discussions with prominent historians on their work and on our subject, which is the history of resistance. Today, we're welcoming Scott Anderson, who wrote this book, Lawrence in Arabia, which was a National Book Critics Award finalist and a bestseller. I envy him that. The New York Times called it superbly finely tuned, original, illuminating.
and I totally understand that. It kind of goes to what I said a minute ago, that Lawrence's importance. Lawrence didn't invent guerrilla warfare. Lawrence didn't, he wasn't the rallying force that he's often portrayed as, of the Arab forces. I think he had a unique ability to understand and to appreciate the Arab way of living and of fighting. And I think that was kind of the source of his strength. The other source of his strength, of course, which is not nearly as romantic, is that he had the money. He had the guns and the money that were coming from the British in Cairo. So he had this unique position as this liaison between the two sides. If it had, when Lawrence entered the picture, the Arab revolt had already started about 10 months earlier and had gone dormant. And there were a couple of British officers, a couple of French officers, but very few that were in the region at the time. But it had kind of fizzled out, and it was really Lawrence's, I don't know if you want to call it genius, or at least his acumen, that he saw that Faisal, Hussein's younger son, was kind of the natural leader, and kind of anointed Faisal in convincing the British that he was the man that they should mostly be supporting. So he played this very key intermediary role. And again, I can't stress enough how much this has to do with the low level of importance that the West was being given to the region. Lawrence was a 28-year-old major. If they had put importance on it, it would have been a lieutenant colonel at least. In regard to Aqaba, and in regard to like choosing between sources, because there's a number of points in Lawrence's story that I have issue with. One being when he was captured and tortured and sexually assaulted by the Turks in Deraa. There's something about his account that makes no sense with that. It's this. He's captured, he's severely tortured, and then he escapes from this room and gets on a horse and rides 50 miles. It just doesn't make any sense. So there are a number of things about Lawrence's account that I never, fully trusted. Specifically with Aqaba, I know that there's a whole alternate account, but in tracing back how that happened, and I mean, it's a very good question of who actually was the original idea of it. The reason I kind of credit Lawrence with it is because it fits into his ideas of how to wage guerrilla warfare, and this idea of falling on of approaching the enemy like a gas and approaching it from behind and catching it at its weak point. I also think that what really leaned me towards that idea was that, at the time the Arab world was extremely tribalistic, and so as the Arab army was being formed, if you formed an alliance with one tribe or one clan, it often meant you sacrificed making an alliance with another one. So I think it would be very hard that an Arab chieftain would have been able to gather up enough other tribes, other clans to carry out an operation like Aqaba. And again, Lawrence was the one who he understood the importance of taking Aqaba, because if the Arabs didn't take Aqaba, the British and the French were going to come ashore and then bottle up the Arab revolt in the Arabian Peninsula, keep it out of the heartland of Syria and Lebanon. So Lawrence, I think, more than an Arab chieftain in the field, would have appreciated the really vital importance of taking Aqaba.
Ata Abu Taya was part of that assault, even if he didn't concede it.
I'm sorry?
Ata Abu Taya,
Yeah,
was the chief of the Hawitat, and he
right.
was involved in it, and he was in the.
Oh, he was absolutely, yeah, even though he was instrumental.
But he may not
Yeah.
have conceived it himself.
Right. No, but completely, yeah. I mean, Lawrence was one guy. it totally the success of anything completely depended on the Arab forces, and it was different. It was Abu Tai in Aqaba, but it was other Arab chieftains in other times.
So who has another question? Don't be shy. Yeah, I know you have hundreds, so please come forward. Please come forward. Say your name and where you.
First off, thank you, Mr. Anderson, for having the time, and thank you, Mr. Glass, for making this happen. My name is Rania, and I'm a senior econ and finance student. So basically, I'm just gonna ask my question, which kind of correlated to what Safwan have asked. So Winston Churchill have famously said that history is written by victors. And
Right.
from the Arab perspective, we believe that the narrative of the Arab Revolt was written by the Western powers, particularly through figures like Lawrence. Now, my question is, since you've done an extensive research on the Arab Revolt, do you believe that the narrative of the Arab Revolt was influenced by these Western powers to the point that it overlooked the resistance that the Arab have put in that revolt? And if you think so, what can we as Arab do to reshape the narrative to be more related to the accurate one, which is that they have put a lot of effort to fight for their independence?
That's a great question. Yes, I mean absolutely. History is usually written by the victors, and certainly the Western powers, especially Great Britain and France, had a very vested interest in making them. And this is a pattern you see all over the colonial world, especially with the British and the French, that they portray themselves as the liberators when they come into a place, and freeing a people from another power or their primitive ways. I mean, they did this all over Africa, and in Asia as well. I think also what happened was because the Middle East very quickly after World War I, certainly by World War II, just 20 some odd years later, had become so vitally important, because of oil, because of primarily because of oil, that they had even a stronger interest in legitimizing their own, the British and the French especially, their own claim to the region. So I think it'd be interesting to compare, say, sub-Saharan Africa with the Middle East, with the Arab world, because both have a kind of a similar narrative of British and French subjugation, colonization. But because sub-Saharan Africa never became as important, the need for the British and French to kind of justify the lines they drew, the actions they took, were never as strong, if that makes sense. That they had to legitimize their influence and the way they had divided up the region as kind of this idea of them being sort of a liberation force. I just finished a book on the Iranian Revolution and the overthrow of the Shah in 1978, and the British completely dominated Iran. Originally it was between the Russians and the British, the so-called Great Game, where they used Iran, Persia as a football, but then the British got control of the oil in Iran and controlled the country for the next 50 years. So I think it's important to your last point, Rania, that I think it's important that the world knows, what colonialism actually looks like, and that absolutely that the Arab world was struggling for its own independence. Especially the British kind of piggybacked on that, so in a way to kind of hijack it. And again, I think it goes to so much of the problems in the region today. But I think that it requires people just to keep looking at those alternate histories and promoting them.
Just to circle back on the last part, thank you so much, first off. But just to circle back on the last part of my question, I would like to take your advice. What would be your advice for us as an Arab and as a student to reshape the narrative of the Arab Revolut to accurately reflect the effort that the Arab have put to achieve their independence?
You know, one of the difficulties too is that there's not a lot of written record, and that's a problem in the Arab world. You know, I spent months in the National Archives in London, and the British saved every piece of paper that they could find. It's astonishing that what you can find in the British archives. I tried to get the degree to which there is kind of an Arab literature about, especially about the Arab revolt in the Arabian Peninsula, to the degree that there's any written word is either in the Ottoman archives, which is very difficult to navigate, or it's in Arabia somehow. I tried over and over and over again to get access to go into Saudi Arabia. I was never allowed to. Now I could go as a tourist, but 10 years ago to go in as a journalist was very, very difficult. So I think one of the built-in problems is, and again, it's you know, you start out by saying, you know, victory is written, history is written by the victor. History is also written by the people who have the archives. You know, this is in my own country. This is why about the American West and the subjugation of the American Indian tribes. It's almost always, almost all the documentary evidence is from the white person's side. There's virtually nothing from the Native American side, and you know, this is just this is a kind of a problem of paper, you know, of records.
I think you touched up on an answer of another question that I had, which is how did you do your research and gathered information for the book Lawrence of Arabia? Was it easy for you to access these documents? Which documents did you use? I would like to know more.
Yeah, I mean, the overwhelming amount of documents I got were so for Lawrence, it was in the British Archives in London. I got very little archives in France because their national archives was under reconstruction, or all the files were in chaos. Again, I couldn't get access to the Arab archives. I did a little bit of the Ottoman, the Turkish archives, and then for my other characters. So for there's a Jewish agronomist who set up a spy ring in Palestine. There was records of him. He wrote his records were now in Israel. The German, his records were in Germany. So I had a researcher who spoke German go and look through the archives there. And then for the American, I was able to find where he had donated his papers at a small university. And so I went and spent time there going through his records.
Is it safe to say that well, the resources that you got was from one side, which is the white people side or the Western side? But like as a journalist, do you think that was like a bit biased in your writing?
Well, I mean, like, it kind of goes back to what I was saying before. It's like you have to go with where the written record is and where what you can prove. Is it biased? You know, I wasn't my whole idea with this book is to kind of show how the modern Middle East was created and how the British and the French stepped in, and you know, however the Arab Revolt started, whoever the main leaders of it were, their aspirations, their concerns at the end of World War I were completely ignored by the British and the French as they carved up the region between themselves. So I mean, is it biased in that I spend more time talking about the Western players? Yes, because there's just not the written record of the Arab players.
Okay, you touch up upon another question that I had, which is what inspired you to actually write the book? What was your motive? Why you were interested in Lawrence and Arabia?
So it was a lot because I've reported a lot from the region, and like I said at the beginning, what I was very aware, I'm not a historian by training, but whenever I would have a very, in-depth conversation with people in the region, even if when I would be talking with Charlie or, this knowledge that to really understand how we arrived at the situation today, that so much of the seeds of that were planted at the end of World War I, and I really wanted to kind of explore why, what happened, because I didn't know much about it, and I don't think many Westerners knew much about it. But clearly, so many of the negative seeds were planted in the region by the arbitrary carving up of countries or creation of countries, at the end of World War I.
Okay. And I have two more questions. Okay, one more. Okay. It's gonna be a tough one. Okay. Okay, it's gonna be like my last question. In
Okay.
the 27 articles of Lawrence in Arabia, I've seen a recurring themes of mentioning concepts that are related to the 48 laws of power, which are like 48 laws of manipulation. And that made me think of Lawrence as a great manipulator. And then that made me question his partnership, his like relation with Faisal. Was it a true partnership, or was he just a good manipulator? Not sure if my question is clear.
I think Lawrence was a manipulator of a lot of things. I think, to my mind, what makes Lawrence a fascinating figure is that I think he went to Arabia he was a British officer. I think that it's pretty clear his record, both of his writings and of his actions, were that over time he realized that he knew the secret plan of the British and French to divide up the region between themselves, despite the promises that had been made that virtually all of the Arab world was going to have its independence. He knew that they were going to be betrayed. And I think he became a man really caught between two loyalties, loyalty to his home country, to the crown, but even more powerful is loyalty to the men he was fighting alongside, that he was helping recruit to fight for the cause, knowing while he was doing that his own country was working to betray them. And from a kind of a novelistic or kind of from a story standpoint, that's an incredibly interesting conflict for a person to have. And I think that his actions as time went on very clearly show that he was very conflicted by it and tilting more and more to the Arab side, to the point where I make the point in the book that from a purely legalistic standpoint, Lawrence was a traitor to the British cause. He told Faisal, and this is absolutely confirmed, that he told Faisal about the secret plan to divide up the Arab world between the British and the French. And this was part of the motivation for taking Aqaba, was that, look, if you want independence, if you want the Arab people to be free, you have to fight for yourselves. You can't rely on the British, because the British are going to betray you. And that's a really interesting thing coming from a British officer, I think.
Great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Who has the next question?
Hello, Mr. Anderson.
Hi.
I'm Ali. I'm a third-year computer engineering student. I have a question, not necessarily relating to past events, but something looking at what's happening in our world today. The Arab world is still plagued with the occupation, and so is the rest of the world. But specifically, us growing up in Lebanon and living here, we heard a lot of stories about the occupation. Now, my question to you is, as we saw, Lawrence's the battalion, the resistance that Lawrence led was pretty successful. They were able to defeat, in a way, the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire. So my question is, what made Lawrence's resistance more successful than the resistance we see in the Arab world today? Since we haven't gotten much, we haven't had much success in liberating Palestine, liberating the villages in south of Lebanon, or the Golan Heights in Syria, for example.
Right. I think what made the Arab Revolt, I think, from a standpoint of guerrilla tactics, I think and again, Lawrence didn't invent it. Some of Lawrence's biographers, want to make him the grandfather of guerrilla warfare, which is silly. But what he did understand when fighting the Ottomans is that it's very much, you see parallels between what Lawrence was advocating in Arabia with what Mao did in China. This idea that you control the countryside, you move freely through the countryside, you choose when to engage the enemy. But at the same time, the enemy has to cover everything, right? They have to. So you string out the enemy, and certainly, like, by keeping the Hejaz Railway open all the way into the Arabian Peninsula, you had the Ottoman army stretched out over 2,000 kilometers, and the Arabs could pick and choose where to attack. The kind of, frankly, really interesting idea of not wanting to capture the Ottoman forces, but to actually keep the life support system of the railway alive, to keep it on just life support, so they would have to defend it. It's kind of pretty clever idea. I think the problem today is that, for one thing, you don't have an Arab nation. You have a bunch of different ones. And in the past, there's been rivalries between them. And you're going up against an enemy in Israel that is incredibly sophisticated, has state-of-the-art weaponry. And you have a Western world that has been, at least, well, I'll say an American world, at least, that has been completely acquiescent to whatever they do. And that has, to my mind, that has just accelerated through time, so that now you have this, I mean, by almost any definition, a genocide happening in Gaza, and you hear nothing from the American government. I don't know that would have been the same case 10, 15, 20 years ago, but I think the huge problem you have right now, from my vantage point, is in my country, both political parties are completely, they compete with one another to be the most in Israel's pocket. And, my personal feeling is what you have right now in Israel is you have a prime minister who has decided that, because of his own mistakes, both strategic mistakes in the past of what happened on October 7th, but also his own corruption. He's up on corruption charges all the time, Netanyahu. That he's made the decision that as long as he can keep the country on a war footing, and that he's safe. That once the fighting stops, the questions are really going to start about his rule and about his misrule, and that he's in trouble. So I think he's made the very cynical decision that as long as he keeps the bombing and the killing going, then his political stability is assured, and he's getting a free ride in that from the Americans. And I was in Gaza a number of years ago, and I just saw this sort of technology that this was when the Israelis still had the settlements inside Gaza. And they were protecting them before they left them. But this sort of technology that the Israelis had, and that I felt like the Palestinians really didn't have much of a clue of how completely out from a standpoint of military weaponry, they were completely out of touch with what the Israelis were capable of, and it was very difficult to do anything about it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Anderson. So to conclude, you'd say that the reason why these revolutions, these resistance movements haven't been as successful as previous resistance movements, would you say it's more because they are going up against an enemy that is overfunded, that is a lot more technologically advanced, or would you say that maybe a lack of strategy plays also a bit and plays a role in their failures?
Yeah, I think probably a combination of those two. I would put more emphasis on the first. That you really are dealing with, frankly, by now one of the most powerful militaries in the world in Israel. I think another element is the element of rivalry within the Arab world, and how there have been times when one Arab nation will subvert another one, for its own self-interest. Of course, Iran is not Arab, but I just finished this book on the Iranian Revolution, and it was very clear that in Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini was in exile in Iraq, and for a long time, because Iraq and Iran were at each other's throats, that it was very clear that Iraq, helped support Khomeini against the Shah, and it was only kind of in the last days when Saddam Hussein started worrying about the kind of the Shia revolutionary movement spreading into Iraq that he moved against Khomeini. So, if you really look at the Iranian Revolution, the Iraqi government played a very strong role in undermining the Shah. And I think you can see that happening again and again throughout the region, in the role that Syria has played at times, in the role that Turkey has played at times. So I think that I think there's just a lot of internal strife that goes on that undermines any idea of kind of focusing exclusively on Israel. And now, of course, you have the Abraham Accords and different governments for economic reasons, kind of selling out the Palestinians, in my opinion. So,
All right, thank you so much.
sure.
Hello, Mr. Anderson.
Hi.
Thank you for being here today.
Yeah.
My name is Amin, and I'm a media and communications senior. I realize my question is kind of asking you to speculate, but do you think a figure like Lawrence of Arabia is replicable in the modern era, considering the current climate? And would the implementation of a Western figure in Arab resistance alter Western perceptions to its benefit, or would it co-opt the movement to its detriment?
It's a great question. I don't think it's possible today. I think that I don't think you could have an outside sort of unifying figure, like Lawrence was. I think that history has kind of moved on. I think that was really probably only possible with a kind of colonial mindset. So I don't think that is replicable in the modern age. But on the flip side, it's very easy for, say, Israel, to brand. I mean, let's face it. There's a tremendous, especially probably since September 11th in this country. There's this very strong I would say more anti-Muslim bias or anti-Arab bias. So it's very easy for if there's a local leader to come up, that for Israel and Israel's supporters to brand him or her as a terrorist, as a supporter of terrorist causes. So I think that there's a historical narrative that's very hard to fight against. That's very ingrained in the West at this point. If some sort of Western leader could come, I can't really conceive of it, that could happen. Yeah. So.
Thank you.
You bet.
Hi, Mr. Anderson. I'm Mona. I'm a first-year pre-med student.
And for me, I'm very interested in learning how history has influenced like modern day behavior. And my questions kind of follows up with the previous questions, but mine is, do you think there are any historical parallels between the events of Lawrence and Arabia and recent conflicts in this region, in the Arab region?
Um, hmm,
Maybe in terms of culture and how they think and how this
yeah.
evolution is similar in thought or maybe not.
Well, I think that one thing that Lawrence understood was um, he understood the importance of the tribal and clan structure in the Arab world, and he used that to I think to the benefit of his cause or of the Arab cause in World War One. I think that is a knowledge that's it's certainly from a Western standpoint or from an American standpoint seems to again and again escape notice by American politicians, American generals, and I think you really saw it in Iraq that there was no conception on the American standpoint of what they were doing by coming into that country and tearing it apart, and this idea that one thing that I think especially my country kind of forgets, and you're seeing it now today in Iran, is that no matter what the indigenous government is, say in the case of Iraq and with Saddam Hussein, who was brutal, who was despotic, but nobody likes to be bombed by foreign powers, and so this idea that Americans were going to come into Iraq as liberators, and famously, Vice President Cheney said they're going to throw roses at our soldiers, in the streets of Baghdad. This is just a kind of a silly fantasy that somehow Americans don't ever seem to understand. Likewise, and I see it in Iran today with the Israeli and American bombing of Iran in June. That when you bomb a foreign country, what happens? Even if the government is unpopular, there's this natural what you call rallying around the flag effect. And so I've talked to a number of people in the opposition inside Iran since the Israeli and American bombings, and they all say, this was a gift to the regime. This was because now if we go out in opposition of the regime, we can be painted as lackeys of the Israelis and the Americans. So I mean, is there to be learned something from? I think what Lawrence understood, he understood the complexity of Arab society. And again, going back to this kind of clan and tribal structure, because and so Arab nationalism at that point was this kind of embryonic idea. Would there have ever been one Arab nation? I tend to doubt it, because you had such a, going back to 1917, 1918, the difference between, say, Syria and the Arabian Peninsula was centuries difference, right? They still had slaves in the Arabian Peninsula, and Syria was the center of, Damascus was the center of learning and very sophisticated and westernized. So I think that, once again, what the Western powers have missed and why Lawrence was able to be as successful as he was is really kind of understanding the basic culture. But I think that it's remarkable how little has been learned over the past 100 years by the Western powers.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
Come on, somebody, anybody. Okay.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Lee. I just wanted to ask, I thought that your book did a really good job of portraying Lawrence not necessarily as like a romantic figure, as a flawed individual, but I did want to ask, to what extent do you think that the pan-Arab ideal, or that the idea of having a united Arab nation, was a westernized, sort of imposed romantic notion, or rather than an Arab initiative?
Another great question. I think that, you know, again, I mean, to what degree, you know, was Hussein, Emir Hussein, you know, really conscious of this idea that this was going to be one unified nation under his or someone else's rule? Or was it more just that they wanted to be out from, you know, the Ottoman yoke? I tend to think that the idea was pretty embryonic at that stage. And you know, going to what I just said, I don't know how much you know you know, somebody from the middle class in, say, Damascus would have had in common with somebody from you know, well, Riyadh was just like an oasis village at that time. You know, but say somebody from Medina, it was such a vastly different range of cultures and range of experiences across the Arab world. But I think that probably at the flip side, I've always felt, and I really felt this when I was doing my special report for the New York Times on the Arab Spring. There's always been this kinship within the Arab world. I think it's kind of a Western construction to say it's about independence or unification, but there is this kind of cross-Arab identification that is very powerful, and maybe that's where the seeds of a kind of a you know, a pan-Arab nation come from. I remember I was in Cairo. This was, I don't know, 2006, 2005, 2006, and I was meeting someone that morning, and one morning, and she, when I met her, she was very upset, and she said, "Oh, did you hear this? You know, there was a suicide bomber and 140 people were killed." And I went, "Where? In Cairo?" And she said, "No, in Baghdad." I mean, this was during the American invasion of Iraq. But there was this sense of kinship between, you know, this Egyptian woman and what was happening in Iraq that I don't think you would have seen if you'd been talking to an Englishman and this had happened in Czechoslovakia or Czech Republic. So I think that there is this Arab identification that is, I'm not sure what to really compare it to, but I think that's kind of the seeds of what became the kind of independence movement. But I do think that probably in 1915, 1916, it was a pretty embryonic idea.
And we've talked a lot about the further east, but how does North Africa play into that?
I'm sorry, how does
North Africa more broadly play into that? Considering Tunisia and Algeria, was there the same sort of drive to unite in 1917 North Africa as well as the Middle East? As
you
in
know,
all
it
of the Arab
seemed, yeah,
peoples?
right. It seemed to come in North Africa. It seemed to come later, and I think it's because there was far more commercial ties between, say, you know, so Morocco or Algeria with France. It was much more in the web of the larger French Empire, where it was really just kind of, well, and of course there was the French connection from a religious standpoint in Syria, that they were the protectors of the Christian population. But I think that the ties with North Africa were much closer. And also much easier to control, because you know, certainly in Libya or Algeria, most of the population is along the coast. You're much closer to France and to Italy to control. It didn't really, right. I mean, it seemed to be very much a kind of an afterthought in World War I. There was a little bit of fighting in kind of the German funding of a insurgent group in eastern, what wasn't Libya then, but eastern Libya. But you know, really the focus was on, I mean, the cities that were the most important in that part of the world, of course, is Constantinople because of the Ottomans, Cairo because it was the British military, Mecca because that was the mantle of authority from Emir Hussein. and if as you went out further from and Damascus, of course, because of the kind of the cultural heart of the Arab world, as you moved further away from there, I think things became more and more peripheral.
Don't take note from us. Somebody got up. Realize our truth. You're doing better than I. They never even asked me any questions. So you're doing much better.
Well, you're forcing them to get up.
You're more comfortable with that. So your name.
Okay, my name is Ramis Kanj, and I'm a third-year computer science student.
Hi.
So I've got a bit of a controversial question, but
Okay.
so we read about how vast spaces like the desert made guerrilla tactics effective in Lawrence's time, but today in Gaza the resistance is boxed in, so it's a completely different situation. And there's an opinion where some people argue that Israel could take Gaza if it wanted to, but that its ongoing existence serves a strategic purpose because it keeps the conflict alive. And as a apartheid colonizing state, that's what you want in the region. So what's your view on this opinion and how it relates to the whole desert and guerrilla tactics?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I don't think the Israelis want to take over Gaza. Why, I mean, why would they? Because it's they're unless they kick out all the Palestinians, then this becomes their immediate problem, right? So I think it's a complete kind of political theater, military theater, if you will, that the Israelis are pulling off. What I think is more interesting I mean, yes, essentially Gaza is. I've spent quite a bit of time there. It's just a walled-in prison, and it's such a small area. There is a massive wall all the way around it. Where I think you see more of the idea of this open space and the danger of that is in the West Bank, where, of course, you have this wall all the way around on the Israeli side, but you also have this whole network of roads that Arabs are not allowed to travel on. These special highways that only Israelis can. So you have, in fact, in that whole area, which is obviously vastly larger than Gaza, it's all been wired to keep track of everything and to keep complete control of movement. I'm sure the Israelis, if they wanted to, they could, because of this whole network of special roads and special checkpoints, they could lock down the entire West Bank in probably in 3 days if they really wanted to. But again, then they're inheriting the problem. It kind of reminds me, going back to Lawrence and not wanting to, during the Arab Revolt, not wanting to take the Hejaz Railway. It's like once you take it and you all those people are your prisoners, then you've got to feed them, you've got to guard them, you've got whatever you want to do with them. But then now they're directly your charge. So I think what's happening in Gaza, I mean, I think it's really hideous. I think that the slaughter there of Palestinians is being used as a bargaining chip by the Israeli government to what? To get concessions on the West Bank, to get the Americans to be even more kind of complacent to whatever they want to do, to annexing the West Bank. At this point, I mean, that idea would have been unthinkable in the American government 10 years ago, that they would actually annex the West Bank. Now I'm not so sure. If Netanyahu went to Trump and said, "Hey, we'll stop slaughtering the Palestinians in Gaza, but now we want these whole huge zones in the West Bank to be officially part of Israel," I mean, I think Trump would let him do it. The whole idea of moving the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, I mean, that never would have happened 10 years ago. So I'm kind of talking around your thing, but I think that no, I don't think the Israelis really have any interest in taking complete control of Gaza.
Next. Ask another. You can think of something. Please.
Yes. Safwan from Jordan again. I
Hi.
wanted to ask you if did you expect that your book is gonna be this much influential? As you said that this in this period of time from the Arab history, there isn't much archive or written history about the whole era. So a lot of people knowledge is based on your book and like maybe a couple of other books. So did you expect this kind of influential, and like how did you handle this kind of weight if everyone is going back to your books, you know?
Yeah, I think what made my book I don't know if completely unique, but kind of interesting is for people was that it wasn't just about Lawrence. Lawrence has been done to death, but it was more trying to take this larger view of what happened in the region. What were the Americans doing? What were the French doing? What were the Germans doing? The Germans were obviously trying to provoke anti-colonial rebellion against the British and the French because they're on opposite sides of the war. So I think the idea I had was to kind of go beyond Lawrence, even though I do see Lawrence and did then as a prime actor in what happened in the Middle East at the time, but to kind of see what others were doing, what other powers were doing, and so I have this American character in the book who again and again gets things wrong about the region. He really doesn't understand the region very well. And as I mentioned earlier, he's secretly on the payroll of Standard Oil, an American oil company. But to my mind, that's sort of emblematic of American view of the region at the time. Prior to World War I breaking out, you could go back to the State Department records of what they knew about the Middle East, and it would literally be somebody's like a diplomat's aunt had done a tour of Constantinople and written a letter back and saying, oh, I went to the minaret, I went to the mosque, and it's a beautiful city. And that would be all that would be in the file for, say, 2 years. So the ignorance of America towards the region goes back a very, very long way, and it continues to this day. But so I think that maybe is what the strength of my book was, to kind of look at the different powers and how how the Germans were trying to provoke this anti-colonial thing to their benefit. What the Turks were doing. What the French were doing. So, and all those powers, of course, gave us what the Middle East is today.
Hi, my name is Leah, and I'm a senior psychology major. You already touched up about what I'm about to ask you, but I want to see if there was more depth to it. So my question is, to what extent were Lawrence's actions motivated by Arab independence versus British political goals? And in your expert opinion, was he truly an ally of the Arabs, or basically just fully an agent of British imperialism using the Arabs to achieve British objectives?
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, I think what makes Lawrence interesting, and still interesting 100 years later, is that I think he absolutely started out as an agent of British influence. I mean, he was a British military intelligence officer, and that was his whole reason for going to Arabia. I think as time went on, he became more and more disgusted by the plan of the British and the French governments of carving up the region. A direct betrayal of what had been promised Emir Hussein in starting the Arab Revolt. And I think one thing that's important, just from a humanistic standpoint, well, it's usually men that go to war. Men fight and die for the people around them. They don't They don't fight and die for a cause or for a flag. And so nobody in World War One's or any war, they don't go across to be machine gunned because of their love of Queen Victoria or whatever. They risk their lives and they die because of their immediate people around them that they see going through the same hardships as them. And I think that Lawrence was very much the same way. He spent 2 years living amongst the Arabs in times really brutal conditions and watching men die, men that he had helped recruit to fight. And I think that at a certain point, it became the moral dilemma that it placed him in. He very clearly went over to the Arab side. The race to get to Damascus before the British army. That was largely inspired by Lawrence because he knew that if the Arab army could get to Damascus before the British did, his own army, that then the Arab army would have claim to Damascus, to Syria, against the French, and the French had already been promised Syria. So I think when you look at his actions in the last days of the war, it very much speaks to him trying to subvert the secret deal that had been made, the Sykes-Picot agreement that had been made between the British and the French. And I think that ultimately is that to me is what's really interesting about Lawrence. And to me, that is kind of the heart of the Lawrence story, of this man caught between two loyalties and ending up choosing the loyalty of the side of the men he's against. And then, of course, he goes as a representative of Faisal to the Paris Peace Conference and trying to represent the Arab cause to the point. And I think this kind of goes ultimately to answer your question. Was he a British agent or was he really fighting for the Arabs? He was ordered out of Paris by his own government, by the British government, because he was still a sitting officer. So they withdrew him back to England. They barred him from having any role with Faisal in Paris. And so without Lawrence there, the Arabs were sold down the river by the British and the French. And Lawrence was put back in a barracks in southern England and having no contact with Faisal or any of the other Arab delegation. So, I don't think Lawrence's importance is that he was somehow the father of Arab nationalism, or the hugely. I mean, he was important. Was he the absolute creator of stuff? No, but to my mind, so I understand the idea of why a lot of Arabs are annoyed again, like why this 5'4" little Brit is always at center stage of the Arab story. But that to me is not what was interesting about Lawrence, and that's not what I'm trying to justify that is in fact earned. But it's more this idea that that this was a man caught between loyalties, and I find that interesting.
Thank you for your time.
Sure. Yeah.
As you may know, the title of our course is The History of Resistance. And Lawrence wrote a lot during and after the war about guerrilla warfare.
Right.
As a form of resistance to occupation, particularly Ottoman occupation. How much influence do you think he subsequently had? I know, for example, that in 1940, when the British created Special Operations Executive after the occupation of France, Colin Gubbins, who became the chief of Special Operations Executive, quoted Lawrence and the IRA as his two models for what we wanted to do in occupied Europe, which was basically what Churchill called set Europe ablaze, terrorize the Germans. In quoting Lawrence and the IRA, against whom Gubbins had fought from 1919 to 1921 in Ireland. Is it fair to say that Lawrence actually did have a great deal of influence on the subsequent use of guerrilla warfare?
Yeah, I think he did have a a huge influence. And again, I mean, I think it's hard to draw a straight line because, certainly you can see, I mentioned Mao's, the Chinese Red Army, the tactics they used in China, the tactics the Viet Cong used against the Americans. I mean, was it influenced by Lawrence, or is it just kind of the natural default position you fall back to when you're fighting a more powerful military than yourself? One thing that I think, this is kind of a departure from your question, but one thing that I think is interesting, that I think Lawrence foresaw this explosion of nationalism that was coming, and it was just around the corner in World War One. Well, you started seeing it in World War One, say in the Balkans and things. This centrifugal force of ripping places apart. But you really saw it in World War II. And somebody earlier brought up the quote about history is written by the victors. And one thing I think about World War II that's never really gotten its due is how much, whether it was, I mean, less the Germans going into Eastern Europe, but I really think of the Japanese going through Southeast Asia, how they swept through. Why did they sweep through so quickly? Because initially, the Indonesians, the Malayans, the Vietnamese, they saw them as liberators against their colonial masters. And that's been kind of whitewashed by history. How did the Japanese take over all of Indonesia in about 3 weeks? It's because the local people supported them. And we don't know that because what we know about the Japanese in World War II is that they were conquerors, they're imperialists, but they very much took advantage of that initial thing of the nascent nationalism spirit and anti-colonialism in the region. And I think that you see antecedents in that going back, with Lawrence in Arabia too, with this throwing off the Ottoman yoke of that was its own imperial power at the time.
In another book of yours, Innocent Americans,
Yeah.
you trace, I guess I would call it the influence of SOE on what became the CIA. And the CIA began trying to arm guerrilla bands in Albania, Ukraine, and so forth. How did that play out?
Not well. Not well at all, because I think, certainly what you had, it worked okay in the Philippines. And ironically, because there was an anti-communist insurgency in the Philippines, and with very little money, and probably because they had very little money. Again, I'm almost reminded of Lawrence in that, a handful of American military advisors were instrumental in reforming the Philippine government and successfully defeating the communist insurgency in the Philippines. And I think one of the reasons they were able to do it is because they did it on a shoestring. They did it with virtually no money, which meant they had to go out and do this kind of win over the local people to their side. Where I think that the Americans have failed again and again is in just pouring in money, pouring in troops, pouring in materiel, and fighting the war that they want to fight, which is not the way to fight a guerrilla insurgency. And so likewise, I think that you see a parallel between what the Americans did in the Philippines against the communist insurgency in the late 1940s. Lawrence had virtually no money. He had to be smart. He was getting very little money out of the British High Command in Cairo, so he had to improvise and had to build this kind of grassroots alliance that proved to be formidable. And again, you saw that 30 years later in the Philippines.
Anyone else have a question? Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Fadil. I'm a computer science senior. I was going to ask you, in light of recent wars and conflicts, Israel has been portrayed as the unbeatable. So people have been calling for Hamas or Hezbollah here to disarm. So go with things like diplomatic. So do you think there's a possibility for a diplomatic, like, what do you call it?
Like
Yeah, a diplomatic solution, with Israel, or it's like simply impossible?
I think it's impossible with the current Israeli government. I think they have absolutely no interest in having any kind of settlement, and I think that they, by keeping the fighting going on, they just make that more and more impossible to imagine happening. To my mind, what might be interesting is, I mean, what if Hamas gave back the last of the people who were taken on October 7th? Because this is the pretense that Israel's using to basically bulldoze all of Gaza. So if those people were released or those bodies returned, what would be their rationale to continue? This notion of this idea that you're going to just eliminate Hamas or Hezbollah is absurd. I mean, it's these, it's not an army, it's an idea at this point, right? And so there'll be endless recruits for Hamas in the future, and the Israelis know that. Certainly, Netanyahu knows that. So this idea that you're going to continue fighting until Hamas no longer exists, it's just a lie. But and a diplomatic solution? No, I don't think so, because I think that if the fighting stopped, then you would very quickly see, just as you were seeing before October 7th, you'd see Arab countries cutting deals with Israel, betraying the Palestinians again. So no, I wish I could be optimistic, but no, I don't see that happening. The only possible thing, and I really don't have much confidence it would help, would be if they release the people they're still holding, Hamas. But other than that, I don't see really any reason for optimism at all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Final thought. There are many countries that are occupied even as we speak. Tibet, Ukraine, Abkhazia, what would make us believe that resistance in some countries might succeed and in others there's no chance?
Great question. I mean, I think that I think it just comes down to force of arms. Are the Tibetans ever going to get independence? I don't think so. Is there ever going to be a Palestinian state? I highly doubt it. Abkhazia, these, and Abkhazia, can the Georgians ever get it back? Probably not, because now the Russians occupy it. I'm not really very optimistic that most any would work nowadays, because I think not only in the case of Israel you have that power sitting there, but you also have the powers that be behind the scenes look, the idea of the Tibetans ever breaking away from China is, it's just fantasy. And what the Americans or the Americans are going to all of a sudden support a Tibetan resistance army? I don't think so. So I'm not very hopeful that anyone's going to get. They don't have it now. The Kurds are never going to get it, because the four countries where the Kurds live can play the Kurds off forever against each other. I don't see it happening.
Not an optimistic conclusion.
No.
It's hard to be optimistic these days.
Yeah, it is.
Scott Anderson, thank you very much for
speaking
with our class.
Yeah.
We're very grateful to have had you.
Well, thank you, Charlie, and thank you, and thanks for the questions. They're great.
Thanks very much. See you soon.
Yep.
We'll talk
Okay.
later.
All right. Bye-bye.